Welcome. I'm Jane Edwards. I'm a BACP accredited counsellor and psychotherapist and a priest in the Scottish Episcopal Church. And I recently completed a PhD on what makes a good funeral with Durham University. This talk is part of a series of 4 Lent talks for 2024 on death, bereavement, and the making of a good funeral for Christians. And today we're looking at what makes a good Christian funeral. Stop all the clocks, cut off the telephone, prevent the dog from barking with a juicy bone, silence the pianos, and with muffled drum, bring out the coffin, let the mourners come. The first verse of Auden's poem, Funeral Blues, captures something of the essence of the time when a loved one dies. Someone of significance has died, and all must recognize this fact. Life should not just continue as it was. These powerful words convey our need for the death to cause normal life to stop. Stop all the clocks. We know how hard it can be when someone we love dies, and their funeral may be something we dread. But if it's a good funeral, it can be helpful in all sorts of ways. Have you been to a good funeral? What made it good, do you think? I recently completed some research on funerals as part of a PhD, and it involved interviews with 20 people, some who lead funerals and some who'd arranged a funeral for a family member. The results were analysed alongside existing research, and there were 4 main findings to the question of what makes a good funeral. So firstly, compassionate care, expressed by the person leading the funeral and the congregation towards the bereaved family. Secondly, tailored rituals which are tailored to that occasion, that unique person who died. Thirdly, ceremonial expertise. The funeral needs to be well prepared and well led. It's a skill to lead a funeral well within the time there is. And fourthly, containment of death. A good funeral makes it possible to face the reality that our loved one has died. Death is contained. And within these findings, there's some aspects that stand out, and we'll explore some of these now. So, personalization. Is it important that a funeral is personal? Well, plenty of research suggests it is important. Each Christian funeral is a unique occasion and needs careful planning. It's important for those who attend to be able to recognize the person who died through descriptions of their life. It's important that the ceremony reflects the person. It's honoring of the person who died, that their funeral is accurate in speaking about them or in what's included in the ceremony. There are many choices to be made by those closest to the person who died, and it's honouring that these reflect the wishes of their loved one and who they were. Have you thought about your own funeral? Have you thought what hymns, what music you would like? It can be very helpful if we do a bit of planning for our own funeral and let our families and those we're closest to know what we'd like. A funeral is in part to say goodbye to the person who died, and it helps to have an accurate portrayal of who we're saying goodbye to. The life, death, and resurrection of Jesus is the important theological framework for a Christian understanding of death. And so this theology will be reflected in the funeral. But this doesn't mean the uniqueness of the person who died shouldn't be recognized. The Christian faith is an incarnational faith. Jesus lived and loved and grieved when he was on earth. And so having a personalized funeral reflects the incarnational nature of our faith. The Christian funeral can reflect both the divinity and the humanity of Jesus through including a personal focus on the life of the person who died within the wider framework of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. So if we're planning a funeral for a family member who's died, we might be doing this after a long period of caring for them while they were unwell. in which case we're likely to be extremely tired. Or it may have been a sudden event for which we've been unable to prepare and we're in shock. Whatever the circumstances of the death, grief makes us very vulnerable, and the task of planning the funeral may appear very difficult and demanding. But it can be a very helpful process for us. It gives us a chance to focus our thoughts on the person who's died and remember their whole life. Our grief may be very raw and painful at this point, so it's really important that those who are leading the funeral are compassionate. Compassion needs to underpin the planning of the ceremony and how it's conducted on the day. The funeral officiant can show compassion by active listening, by expressing empathy, and by being kind. It can be a time when closeness between the bereaved family and the officiant develops really quickly. How the funeral leader responds can bring comfort and strength at a time where we're at our most vulnerable. So compassionate care is important, and it's one of the marks of a good funeral. It reflects God's compassion for those who are in pain. Moving on to think about tailored rituals. Funeral rituals bring order in a time of chaos, structure in which strong emotions can be expressed safely, and a public acknowledgement of the loss of a member of society. At the funeral, the community gather to support those closest to the person who died to face the death. It marks the beginning of a new stage in the lives of those who attend. The funeral marks the person who died leaving the earthly community, going through death and becoming part of the heavenly community. It marks a change in the relationship between the person who died and all in the community, and a change in the social status of those closest to them. Rituals have the power to bring transformation. They impart energy to those who participate. They propel us forward to a place which is different. In a Christian funeral, we understand this as an encounter with God that has the power to bring transformation. The choices of where to hold the funeral, what to include, who will speak, whether a pall or covering will be over the coffin or not, all these kinds of choices are important. One priest I spoke with said, "The more the family invest in the funeral, the more it will speak for them." Another spoke of creating a funeral that was like a Quaker meeting because the person had been a Quaker. Another held a requiem mass because the liturgy of the mass was central to the life of the person who died. These rituals were in some way tailored to the person and to the bereaved family. There may be familiar readings from Psalm 23 or a poem, but when they're chosen for a particular person's funeral because they fit that person and that family, the funeral is crafted to be a bespoke event. Thinking about who will lead the funeral is important. A good funeral involves ceremonial expertise. Of course, part of this is expressed by the funeral directors, but the ceremony largely depends on the expertise of the priest or other officiant. Those participating in the ceremony need to be supported and cared for. Any multimedia aspects need to be taken account of. The timing needs to be managed. Particularly in the crematorium, there's an amount of time for one funeral, and running over causes difficulties. Even if family members are doing key parts of the ceremony, such as the eulogy, usually the person taking the funeral is there to read it for them if they're unable to on the day. The eulogies given by family members often have a powerful effect on the congregation. They're really personal. The congregation get a glimpse into the relationship between the person who died and those speaking. And often there's an intimacy in that relationship, and the congregation may be very touched by that. There's a tangible sense of how much the person who died was loved, and the congregation will be impacted by this. One important question to consider when there's children in the bereaved family or the wider network is whether they will come to the funeral. Children need to grieve too. They need to mark the death. They need support for their loss. It can help them to see how many others cared for the person who died. And it's important to think through what will help them. Perhaps the funeral could include a children's talk, especially for them. Perhaps they could do drawings that could be placed in the coffin. Perhaps they could perform a piece of music. If they're not given the opportunity to participate in rituals around the death, it can make it harder for them to grieve. They can be disenfranchised. God has a heart for the marginalized, for those who have least power, and in the context of a death, children are often kept on the margins. It's important they're included, and it can help to talk through with them beforehand what it will be like, to answer any questions they have about the coffin, for instance. And important there's support for them on the day. However they're included, they need to be given opportunities to say goodbye to the person who died. And there may be others who are at risk of being disenfranchised. A gay partner, a teenager's girlfriend or boyfriend, a person with learning disabilities. We see through Jesus' actions in the Gospels that God reaches out to those on the margins and brings them to the center. And so in a Christian funeral, those who could be disenfranchised need to be included. And this might involve tailoring the ritual in some way, so that their importance in the life of the person who died is recognized in a way that's meaningful for them. So far, we've spoken about relationships between the person who died and those close to them that were good. But of course, that's not always the case. It's best not to make assumptions if we're going to help someone plan a funeral. It might be we're going to meet with the widow, and when we arrive, we learn that she suffered domestic abuse at her late husband's hands, or that he was unfaithful for years. In the planning stages, acknowledging the feelings she has is important. She might well be angry or relieved that he's died. So the funeral needs to be respectful and truthful about who God is and what God is like. Care needs to be taken in what's said about the person who died. So it can be complex for those leading funerals when amongst those who are bereaved and the person who died, there's a variety of beliefs. Not everyone might have a Christian faith, even if the person who died did. And it's important that Christian funerals have integrity. Integrity for the person who died, integrity for the bereaved family, and integrity for the person leading the funeral. Of course, there's some deaths that are especially hard, the death of children, or when someone's ended their own life. And the compassion and tenderness of the funeral officiant is important in reflecting the love of God. Opportunities to touch the coffin can be helpful for those who need to hold a funeral for their child. It's often unbearably painful for the bereaved family, so it's natural there's lots of touching of the coffin. The family and the officiant co-create a ceremony that fits. The ritual can be tailored to include actions befitting the ceremony for a child. When someone's ended their own life, one important question is whether there'll be a reference made to this in the ceremony. Clearly, the family need to agree if it's going to be acknowledged. Those I interviewed largely thought it was best that it was openly acknowledged that the person had ended their own life. This allows the consolation of God to be sought for all those who are grieving. It makes it more possible for the bereaved family to receive the support of the community. If no reference is made to the sad reality of the person's decision to end their life, it can increase the stigma around this form of death. It can inhibit support for the family because it suggests that death can't be spoken of or needs to be hidden. The institution of the church in the past withheld Christian funerals from people who'd ended their own lives. It denied them the chance to be buried on sacred ground. That the church now is explicit in being compassionate towards a family bereaved by suicide is all the more important to communicate the compassion of God. The ritual of a funeral ceremony makes it possible for us to face a death directly, mark it, and begin to move onto the next stage of our lives. It can stop us from being overwhelmed by death. A Christian funeral will explicitly view the death within the context of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. And this provides a form of containment. When we do this, we assert death can be faced. It's not the end, but rather a gateway to the nearer presence of God. And so if it's sensitively planned and skillfully conducted, a funeral can offer healing. It can bring a family together. It can enable us to say goodbye and let go. It can bring the consolation of God to hurting people and point the way forward to a new chapter in which we go forward, companioned by God, who loves and holds us now and always. Thanks be to God.